Strictly speaking, the Gothic is not Gothic at all, but a phenomenon that originates in the late 18th century, long after enlightened Europeans put the era of Gothic cathedrals, chivalry, and superstition behind them. A phenomenon that begins, in fact, as an embrace of a kind of counterfeit medievalism or as a medieval revival. As a word they applied to a dark and distant past, Gothic gave Romantic period writers and readers a way to describe accounts of terrifying experiences in ancient castles and ruined abbeys, experiences connected with subterranean dungeons, secret passageways, flickering lamps, screams, moans, ghosts, and graveyards. In the long run, Gothic became a label for the macabre, mysterious, supernatural, and terrifying, the pleasurably terrifying. In literature generally, the link that Romantic period writers had forged between the Gothic and antiquated spaces was eventually loosened. Even so, one has only to look, in post-Romantic literature, at the fiction of the Brontes or Poe, or, in our own not-so-modern culture, at movies or video games, to realize that the pleasures of regression the late 18th century Gothic revival provided die hard. Readers continue to seek out opportunities to feel haunted by pasts that will not let themselves be exorcised. The Gothic revival appeared in later 18th century English garden design and architecture before it got into literature. In 1747 Horace Walpole, 1717-1797, younger son of the British Prime Minister, purchased Strawberry Hill, an estate on the River Thames near London, and 3 years later set about remodeling it in what he called a Gothic style. Adding towers, turrets, battlements, arched doors, windows, and ornaments of every description, he created the kind of spurious medieval architecture that survives today mainly in churches and university buildings. Eventually tourists came from all over to see Strawberry Hill and went home to Gothicize their own houses. When the Gothic made its appearance in literature, Walpole was again a trailblazer. In 1764 he published He Castle of Otranto, a self-styled Gothic story featuring a haunted castle, an early, pre-Byronic version of the Byronic hero, suitably named Manfred, mysterious deaths, a moaning ancestral portrait, damsels in distress, violent passions, and strange obsessions. Walpole's gamble that the future of the novel would involve the reclamation of the primitive emotions of fear and wonder provided by the romances of a pre-enlightened age convinced many writers who came after him. By the 1790s novels trading on horror, mystery, and faraway settings flooded the book market. Meanwhile in theaters new special effects were devised to incarnate ghostly apparitions on stage. It is noteworthy that the best-selling author of The Terror School, Anne Radcliffe, the author of its most enduring novel, Mary Shelley, and the author of its most effective send-up, Jane Austen, were all women. Indeed, many of Radcliffe's numerous imitators, and, on occasion, downright plagiarizers, published under the auspices of the Minerva Press, a business whose very name, that of the Goddess of Wisdom, acknowledged the centrality of female authors and readers to this new lucrative trend in the book market. William Lane, the marketing genius who owned the press, also set up a cross-country network of circulating libraries that stocked his ladies' volumes and made them available for hire at modest prices. This section offers extracts from some of the most celebrated works in the Gothic mode, Walpole's offering to as the initiating prototype, William Beckford's Vathek. 1786, which is oriental rather than medieval but similarly blends cruelty, terror, and eroticism, two extremely popular works by Radcliffe, The Queen of Terror, The Romance of the Forest, 1791, and The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, Matthew Lewis's concoction of devilry, sadism, and mob violence, The Monk, 1796. We also include an essay of 1773 in which John and Anne Letitia can provide justification after the fact for Walpole's rebellion against the critical orthodoxies. According to most early critics of novels, the only moral fiction was probable fiction. The Aikins, however, make the business of the novelist lie as much with the pleasures of the imagination as with moral edification and the representation of real life. Their essay suggests why Gothic reading was appealing to so many Romantic poets, visionaries who in their own way dissented from critical rules that would drearily limit literature to the already known and recognizable signs of the poets. Acquaintance with the Terror school of novel writing show up in numerous well-known Romantic poems from the Rime of the Ancient Manor to Manfred. For instance, in Keats's The Eve of 5T. Agnes, a poem that in many respects represents an idealized tale of young love, Porphyro's invasion of Madeline's bedroom has some perturbing connections with the predatory overtones of our extract from The Monk. And Keats's enigmatic fragment This Living Hand can be read as a brilliantly abbreviated version of the kind of tale of terror that aimed to make its readers' blood run cold. Yet it simplifies matters to characterize the Gothic only as an influence on Romanticism. As the concluding pieces in this section suggest, the poets had a love-hate relationship with Gothic writers and, even more so, with Gothic readers. Many contemporary commentators objected to the new school of novels on moral and technical grounds. They complained, for instance, about how plot-driven they were and how cheaply they solved their mysteries. But questions about social class and literary taste were also important. In an era of revolution, in which newly literate workers were reading about the rights of man and crowds were starting to shape history, the very popularity of Gothic novels, the terror writers' capacity to move and manipulate whole crowds with their suspense and trickery, itself represented a source of anxiety. As the 20th century critic E.J. Cleary explains, the unprecedented capacity of the market to absorb at great speed large amounts of a particular type of literary product, the terrorist novel, shook old certainties. Many of the Romantic poets comment, accordingly, on what is scary and pernicious about the Gothic as well as what is scary and pernicious in the Gothic. And throughout their writings, the tales of terror are invoked in ways that enable the writer to construct a divide between high and low culture and to play off the passive absorption associated with the reading of the crowds against the tasteful, active reading that is, according to the writer, practiced by the elite few. In the preface to Lille Ballads, for instance, Wordsworth identifies as a cause of English culture's modern decline the frenetic novels that have blunted their consumers' powers of discrimination and reduced them to a state of almost savage torpor, a negative version of the regression that William Hazlitt, for instance, celebrates as he describes how Radcliffe makes her readers twice children while she forces us to believe all that is strange and next to impossible. Wordsworth follows a hint that he may have found 3 years earlier in Coleridge's review of The Monk, extracted near the end of the section, and suggests that such readers inevitably need higher and higher doses of the violent stimulants that novelists drug pushers of sorts have supplied them. In this way the preface pioneers an account of a mass readership addicted to what will kill it. In similar fashion terrorist novel writing, the short anti-Gothic satire we include near the end of the section, makes it seem, as does our extract containing Coleridge's very funny tirade against the patrons of circulating libraries, that Gothic novels were objects of utterly mindless consumption, absorbed, imbibed, but not read, and that terror was a commodity produced on an assembly line. The extracts with which we close the section register, in other words, a recoil from the Gothic. But Gothic themes frequently come back to haunt the critics of the mode. When they depict popular, commercialized culture's threat to individual autonomy and describe consumers as if they were zombies sunk in trances, the critics appear to rehearse nightmarish scenarios straight out of the tales of terror. Horace Walpole. Walpole's landmark work The Castle of Otranto initially purported to be a translation from, as the title page of the first edition put it, the original Italian of Onoprio mural to, Canon of the Church of 5T. Nicholas at Otranto. The events related in it were supposed to have occurred in the 12th or 13th century. In the second edition, however, Walpole renounced the hoax and confessed his authorship. Rather than presenting the narrative as a remarkable historical discovery, a manuscript from the lost barbaric past, he cast his Gothic story as a novelty, an experiment in blending, he explained, the ancient and modern romance, and in combining the realism that was the hallmark of the up-to-date 18th century novel with the imagination that had flourished in medieval romance and that this realism had suffocated. When the story opens, the villainous Manfred, Prince of Otranto, to get an heir to his estate, has arranged a marriage between his only son, Conrad, and the beautiful Isabella. But on his wedding day Conrad is mysteriously killed, victim of a giant helmet that falls from the sky and crushes him. Lest he should be left without male descendants, Manfred determines to divorce his present wife, Hippolyta, who is past childbearing, and marry Isabella himself. In the extract given here, Isabella learns of his intention and decides to flee the castle by night. The account of her flight suggests how the Gothic novelists, lavishing attention on architectural details, make experiences of terror inseparable from the walls, ceilings, floors, and doors enclosing them. From the Castle of Otranto. From Chapter 1. As it was now evening, the servant who conducted Isabella bore a torch before her. When they came to Manfred, who was walking impatiently about the gallery, he started and said hastily, "Take away that light, and begone." Then shutting the door impetuously, he flung himself upon a bench against the wall, and bade Isabella sit by him. She obeyed trembling. "I sent for you, lady," said he, and then stopped under great appearance of confusion. "My lord." "Yes, I sent for you on a matter of great moment," resumed he. "Dry your tears, young lady, you have lost your bridegroom." "Yes, cruel fate. And I have lost the hopes of my race, but Conrad was not worthy of your beauty." "How?" "My lord," said Isabella, "sure you do not suspect me of not feeling the concern I ought." "My duty and affection would have always think no more of him," interrupted Manfred. "He was a sickly puny child, and heaven has perhaps taken him away that I might not trust the honors of my house on so frail a foundation." The line of Manfred calls for numerous supports. "My foolish fondness for that boy blinded the eyes of my prudence, but it is better as it is. I hope in a few years to have reason to rejoice at the death of Conrad." Words cannot paint the astonishment of Isabella. At first she apprehended that grief had disordered Manfred's understanding. Her next thought just that this strange discourse was designed to ensnare her. She feared that Manfred had perceived her indifference for his son, and in consequence of that idea she replied, "Good my lord, do not doubt my tenderness, my heart would have accompanied my hand. Conrad would have engrossed all my care, and wherever fate shall dispose of me, I shall always cherish his memory, and regard your highness and the virtuous Hippolyta as my parents." "Curse on Hippolyta," cried Manfred, "forget her from this moment as I do. In short, lady, you have missed a husband undeserving of your charms, they shall now be better disposed of. Instead of a sickly boy, you shall have a husband in the prime of his age, who will know how to value your beauties, and who may expect a numerous offspring." "Alas, my lord," said Isabella, "my mind is too sadly engrossed by the recent catastrophe in your family to think of another marriage. If ever my father returns, and it shall be his pleasure, I shall obey, as I did when I consented to give my hand to your son, but until his return, permit me to remain under your hospitable roof, and employ the melancholy hours in assuaging yours, Hippolyta's, and the fair Matilda's affliction." "I desired you once before," said Manfred angrily, "not to name that woman. From this hour she must be a stranger to you, as she must be to me. In short, Isabella, since I cannot give you my son, I offer you myself." "Heavens," cried Isabella, waking from her delusion, "what do I hear? You, my lord. You, my father-in-law. The father of Conrad. The husband of the virtuous and tender Hippolyta. I tell you," said Manfred imperiously, "Hippolyta is no longer my wife. I divorce her from this hour. Too long has she cursed me by her unfruitfulness. My fate depends on having sons, and this night I trust will give a new date to my hopes." At those words he seized the cold hand of Isabella, who was half dead with fright and horror. She shrieked and started from him. Manfred rose to pursue her, when the moon, which was now up and gleamed in at the opposite casement, presented to his sight the plumes of the fatal helmet, which rose to the height of the windows, waving backwards and forwards in a tempestuous manner, and accompanied with a hollow and rustling sound. Isabella, who gathered courage from her situation, and who dreaded nothing so much as Manfred's pursuit of his declaration, cried, "Look, my lord, see, heaven itself declares against your impious intentions." "Heaven nor hell shall impede my designs," said Manfred, advancing again to seize the princess. At that instant the portrait of his grandfather, which hung over the bench where they had been sitting, uttered a deep sigh, and heaved its breast. Isabella, whose back was turned to the picture, saw not the motion, nor knew whence the sound came, but started, and said, "Hark, my lord." What sound was that? And at the same time made towards the door. Manfred, distracted between the flight of Isabella, who had now reached the stairs, and of it unable to keep his eyes from the picture, which began to move, had however advanced some steps after her, still looking backwards on the portrait, when he saw it quit its panel, and descend on the floor with a grave and melancholy air. "Do I dream?" cried Manfred returning, "or are the devils themselves in league against me? Speak, infernal spectre. Or, if thou art my grandsire, why dost thou too conspire against thy wretched descendant, who too dearly pays for?" Ere he could finish the sentence the vision sighed again, and made a sign to Manfred to follow him. "Lead on," cried Manfred, "I will follow thee to the gulf of perdition." The spectre marched sedately, but dejected, to the end of the gallery, and turned into a chamber on the right hand. Manfred accompanied him at a little distance, full of anxiety and horror, but resolved. As he would have entered the chamber, the door was clapped to with violence by an invisible hand. The prince, collecting courage from this delay, would have forcibly burst open the door with his foot, but found that it resisted his utmost efforts. "Since hell will not satisfy my curiosity," said Manfred, "I will use the human means in my power for preserving my race. Isabella shall not escape me." That lady, whose resolution had given way to terror the moment she had quitted Manfred, continued her flight to the bottom of the principal staircase. There she stopped, not knowing whither to direct her steps, nor how to escape from the impetuosity of the prince. The gates of the castle she knew were locked, and guards placed in the court. Should she, as her heart prompted her, go and prepare Hippolyta for the cruel destiny that awaited her, she did not doubt but Manfred would seek her there, and that his violence would incite him to double the injury he meditated, without leaving room for them. To avoid the impetuosity of his passions, delay might give him time to reflect on the horrid measures he had conceived, or produce some circumstance in her favor, if she could for that night at least avoid his odious purpose. Yet where conceal herself? How avoid the pursuit he would infallibly make throughout the castle? As these thoughts passed rapidly through her mind, she recollected a subterraneous passage which led from the vaults of the castle to the church of 5T. Nicholas. Could she reach the altar before she was overtaken, she knew even Manfred's violence would not dare to profane the sacredness of the place, and she determined, if no other means of deliverance offered, to shut herself up forever among the holy virgins, whose convent was contiguous to the cathedral. In this resolution, she seized a lamp that burned at the foot of the staircase, and hurried towards the secret passage. The lower part of the castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters, and it was not easy for one under so much anxiety to find the door that opened into the cavern. An awful silence reigned throughout those subterraneous regions, except now and then some blasts of wind that shook the doors she had passed, and which, grating on the rusty hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. Every murmur struck her with new terror, yet more she dreaded to hear the wrathful voice of Manfred urging his domestics registered to pursue her. She trod as softly as impatience would give her leave, yet frequently stopped and listened to hear if she was followed. In one of those moments she thought she heard a sigh. She shuddered, and recoiled a few paces. In a moment she thought she heard the step of some person. Her blood curdled, she concluded it was Manfred. Every suggestion that horror could inspire rushed into her mind. She condemned her rash flight, which had thus exposed her to his rage in a place where her cries were not likely to draw anybody to her assistance. Yet the sound seemed not to come from behind. If Manfred knew where she was, he must have followed her. She was still in one of the cloisters, and the steps she had heard were too distinct to proceed from the way she had come. Cheered with this reflection, and hoping to find a friend in whoever was not the prince, she was going to advance, when a door that stood ajar, at some distance to the left, was opened gently, but ere her lamp, which she held up, could discover who opened it, the person retreated precipitately on seeing the light. Isabella, whom every incident was sufficient to dismay, hesitated whether she should proceed. Her dread of Manfred soon outweighed every other terror. The very circumstance of the person avoiding her gave her a sort of courage. It could only be, she thought, some domestic belonging to the castle. Her gentleness had never raised her an enemy, and conscious innocence bade her hope that, unless sent by the prince's order to seek her, his servants would rather assist than prevent her flight. Fortifying herself with these reflections, and believing, by what she could observe, that she was near the mouth of the subterraneous cavern, she approached the door that had been opened, but a sudden gust of wind that met her at the door extinguished her lamp, and left her in total darkness. 1764. Anna Letitia Aiken, later Barbald, and John Aiken. In the following essay John Aiken, 1747–1822, and his sister Anna Letitia, who appears earlier in this anthology as a poet and under her married name, Barbald, engage a question philosophers and psychologists continue to debate: why do people who listen to ghost stories around a campfire, or read gothic novels, or watch monster movies find such frightening experience pleasing? The Aikens, members of a prominent family of religious dissenters and educators, begin by observing that it is easy to explain why we might feel satisfaction when we feel pity, that emotion is necessary for the well-being of the human community, which would fall apart were it not somehow in our own interest to feel for others. But it is by contrast more difficult to understand how morality is advanced when we delight in objects of terror. As they map out an alternative way of accounting for that immoral delight, the Aikens write an early romantic description of the glory of the imagination. The reader's encounter with what is unknown and amazing elevates and expands the mind. The fragmentary story of a medieval knight-errant that the Aikens appended to their essay was meant to give their readers a chance to test this thesis, but thanks to its handling of suspense Sir Bertrand soon came to be celebrated in its own right. Published in 1773 in the Aikens' Miscellaneous Pieces in Prose, on the pleasure derived from objects of terror built on Walpole's innovation in offering to it gave the next generation of Gothic authors a critical justification for their engagement with the supernatural and for their swerve away from the didacticism that had valued fiction writers only when they seemed to be educating readers for real life. Family tradition ascribed the essay to Anna and Sir Bertrand to John. On the pleasure derived from objects ot terror. With Sir Bertrand, a fragment. That the exercise of our benevolent feelings, as called forth by the view of human afflictions, should be a source of pleasure, cannot appear wonderful to one who considers that relation between the moral and natural system of man, which has connected a degree of satisfaction with every action or emotion productive of the general welfare. The painful sensation immediately arising from a scene of misery, is so much softened and alleviated by the reflex sense of self-approbation on attending virtuous sympathy, that we find, on the whole, a very exquisite and refined pleasure remaining, which makes us desirous of again being witnesses to such scenes, instead of flying from them with disgust and horror. It is obvious how greatly such a provision must conduce to the ends of mutual support and assistance. But the apparent delight with which we dwell upon objects of pure terror, where our moral feelings are not in the least concerned, and no passion seems to be excited but the depressing one of fear, is a paradox of the heart, much more difficult of solution. The reality of this source of pleasure seems evident from daily observation. The greediness with which the tales of ghosts and goblins, of murders, earthquakes, fires, shipwrecks, and all the most terrible disasters attending human life, are devoured by every ear, must have been generally remarked. Tragedy, the most favorite work of fiction, has taken a full share of those scenes. It has supped full with horrors and has, perhaps, been more indebted to them for public admiration than to its tender and pathetic parts. The ghost of Hamlet, Macbeth descending into the witch's cave, and the tent scene in Richard, command as forcibly the attention of our souls as the parting of Jafar and Belvidera, the fall of Wolsey, or the death of Shore. The inspiration of terror was by the Andean critics assigned as the peculiar province of tragedy, and the Greek and Roman tragedians have introduced some extraordinary personages for this purpose, not only the shades of the dead, but the Furies, and other fabulous inhabitants of the infernal regions. Collins, in his most poetical ode to fear, has finally enforced this idea. Though gently pity claim her mingled part, yet all the thunders of the scene are thine. The old Gothic romance and the Eastern tale, with their genii, giants, enchantments, and transformations, however a refined critic may censure them as absurd and extravagant, will ever retain a most powerful influence on the mind, and interest the reader independently of all peculiarity of taste. Thus the great Milton, who had a strong bias to these wildnesses of the imagination, has with striking effect made the stories of forests and enchantments drear, a favorite subject with his Penseroso, and had undoubtedly their awakening images strong upon his mind when he breaks out. Call up him that left half told the story of Cambuscan Bold, and c.4. How are we then to account for the pleasure derived from such objects? I have often been led to imagine that there is a deception in these cases, and that the avidity with which we attend is not a proof of our receiving real pleasure. The pain of suspense, and the irresistible desire of satisfying curiosity, when once raised, will account for our eagerness to go quite through an adventure, though we suffer actual pain during the whole course of it. We rather choose to suffer the smart pang of a violent emotion than the uneasy craving of an unsatisfied desire. That this principle, in many instances, may involuntarily carry us through what we dislike, I am convinced from experience. This is the impulse which renders the poorest and most insipid narrative interesting when once we get fairly into it, and I have frequently felt it with regard to our modern novels, which, if lying on my table, and taken up in an idle hour, have led me through the most tedious and disgusting pages, while, like pistol eating his leek, I have swallowed and execrated to the end. And it will not only force us through dullness, but through actual torture through the relation of a Damien's execution, or an inquisitor's act of faith registered when children. Therefore, listen with pale and mute attention to the frightful stories of apparitions. We are not, perhaps, to imagine that they are in a state of enjoyment, any more than the poor bird which is dropping into the mouth of the rattlesnake. They are chained by the ears, and fascinated by curiosity. This illusion, however, does not satisfy me with respect to the well-wrought scenes of artificial terror which are formed by a sublime and vigorous imagination. Here, though we know beforehand what to expect, we enter into them with eagerness, in quest of a pleasure already experienced. This is the pleasure constantly attached to the excitement of surprise from new and wonderful objects. A strange and unexpected event awakens the mind, and keeps it on the stretch, and where the agency of invisible beings is introduced, of forms unseen, and mightier far than we, our imagination, darting forth, explores with rapture the new world which is laid open to its view, and rejoices in the expansion of its powers. Passion and fancy cooperating elevate the soul to its highest pitch, and the pain of terror is lost in amazement. Hence the more wild, fanciful, and extraordinary are the circumstance of a scene of horror, the more pleasure we receive from it, and where they are too near common nature, though violently borne by curiosity through the adventure, we cannot repeat it or reflect on it, without an overbalance of pain. In the Araldan Nights are many most striking examples of the terrible joined with the marvelous. The story of Aladdin, and the travels of Sinbad are particularly excellent. The Castle of Otranto is a very spirited modern attempt upon the same plan of mixed terror, adapted to the model of Gothic romance. The best conceived, and most strongly worked up scene of mere natural horror that one recollect, is in Smollett's Ferdinand Count Fathom 7 where the hero, entertained in a lone house in a forest, finds a corpse just slaughtered in the room where he is sent to sleep, and the door of which is locked upon him. It may be amusing for the reader to compare his feelings upon these, and from thence form his opinion of the justness of my theory. The following fragment, in which both these matters are attempted to be in some degree united, is offered to entertain a solitary winter's evening. Sir Bertrand, a fragment. After this adventure, 5Ir Bertrand turned his steed towards the woods registered hoping to cross these dreary moors before the curfew. But ere he had proceeded half his journey, he was bewildered by the different tracks, and not being able, as far as the eye could reach, to espy any object but the brown heath surrounding him, he was at length quite uncertain which way he should direct his course. Night overtook him in this situation. It was one of those nights when the moon gives a faint glimmering off light through the thick black clouds of a lowering sky. Now and then she suddenly emerged in full splendor from her veil, and then instantly retired behind it, having just served to give the forlorn Sir Bertrand a wide extended prospect over the desolate waste. Hope and native courage a while urged him to push forwards, but at length the increasing darkness and fatigue of body and mind overcame him. He dreaded moving from the ground he stood on, for fear of unknown pits and bogs, and alighting from his horse in despair, he threw himself on the ground. He had not long continued in that posture when the sullen toll of a distant bell struck his ears. He started up, and turning towards the sound discerned a dim twinkling light. Instantly he seized his horse's bridle, and with cautious steps advanced towards it. After a painful march he was stopped by a moat ditch surrounding the place from whence the light proceeded, and by a momentary glimpse of moonlight he had a full view of a large antique mansion, with turrets at the corners, and an ample porch in the center. The injuries of time were strongly marked on everything about it. The roof in various places was fallen in, the battlements were half demolished, and the windows broken and dismantled. A drawbridge, with a ruinous gateway at each end, led to the court before the building he entered, and instantly the light, which proceeded from a window in one of the turrets, glided along and vanished. At the same moment the moon sunk beneath a black cloud, and the night was darker than ever. All was silent. Sir Bertrand fastened his steed under a shed, and approaching the house traversed its whole front with light and slow footsteps. All was still as death. He looked in at the lower windows, but could not distinguish a single object through the impenetrable gloom. After a short parley with himself, he entered the porch, and seizing a massy iron knocker at the gate, lifted it up, and hesitating, at length struck a loud stroke. The noise resounded through the whole mansion with hollow echoes. All was still again. He repeated the strokes more boldly and louder. Another interval of silence ensued. A third time he knocked, and a third time all was still. He then fell back to some distance that he might discern whether any light could be seen in the whole front. It again appeared in the same place and quickly glided away as before. At the same instant a deep sullen toll sounded from the turret. Sir Bertrand's heart made a fearful stop. He was a while motionless, then terror impelled him to make some hasty steps towards his steed, but shame stopped his flight, and urged by honor, and a resistless desire of finishing the adventure, he returned to the porch, and working up his soul to a full steadiness of resolution, he drew forth his sword with one hand, and with the other lifted up the latch of the gate. The heavy door, creaking upon its hinges, reluctantly yielded to his hand. He applied his shoulder to it and forced it open. He quitted it, and stepped forward. The door instantly shut with a thundering clap. Sir Bertrand's blood was chilled. He turned back to find the door, and it was long ere his trembling hands could seize it, but his utmost strength could not open it again. After several ineffectual attempts, he looked behind him, and beheld, across a hall, upon a large staircase, a pale bluish flame which cast a dismal gleam of light around. He again summoned forth his courage and advanced towards it. It retired. He came to the foot of the stairs, and after a moment's deliberation ascended. He went slowly up, the flame retiring before him, till he came to a wide gallery. The flame proceeded along it, and he followed in silent horror, treading lightly, for the echoes of his footsteps startled him. It led him to the foot of another staircase, and then vanished at the same instant. Another toll sounded from the turret. Sir Bertrand felt it strike upon his heart. He was now in total darkness, and with his arms extended, began to ascend the second staircase. A dead cold hand met his left hand and firmly grasped it, drawing him forcibly forwards. He endeavored to disengage himself, but could not. He made a furious blow with his sword, and instantly a loud shriek pierced his ears, and the dead hand was left powerless in his. He dropped it, and rushed forwards with a desperate valor. The stairs were narrow and winding, and interrupted by frequent breaches, and loose fragments of stone. The staircase grew narrower and at length terminated in a low iron grate. Sir Bertrand pushed it open. It led to an intricate winding passage, just large enough to admit a person upon his hands and knees. A faint glimmering of light served to show the nature of the place. Sir Bertrand entered. A deep hollow groan resounded from a distance through the vault. He went forwards, and proceeding beyond the first turning, he discerned the same blue flame which had before conducted him. He followed it. The vault, at length, suddenly opened into a lofty gallery, in the midst of which a figure appeared, completely armed, thrusting forwards the bloody stump of an arm, with a terrible frown and menacing gesture, and brandishing a sword in his hand. Sir Bertrand undauntedly sprung forwards, and aiming a fierce blow at the figure, it instantly vanished, letting fall a massy iron key. The flame now rested upon a pair of ample folding doors at the end of the gallery. Sir Bertrand went up to it, and applied the key to a brazen lock. With difficulty he turned the bolt. Instantly the doors flew open, and discovered a large apartment, at the end of which was a coffin rested upon a bier, with a taper burning on each side of it. Along the room on both sides were gigantic statues of black marble, attired in the Moorish habit, and holding enormous sabers in their right hands. Each of them reared his arm, and advanced one leg forwards, as the knight entered. At the same moment the lid of the coffin flew open, and the bell tolled. The flame still glided forwards, and Sir Bertrand resolutely followed, till he arrived within 6 paces of the coffin. Suddenly, a lady in a shroud and black veil rose up in it, and stretched out her arms towards him. At the same time the statues clashed their sabers and advanced. 5 Bertrand flew to the lady and clasped her in his arms. She threw up her veil and kissed his lips, and instantly the whole building shook as with an earthquake, and fell asunder with a horrible crash. 5 Bertrand was thrown into a sudden trance, and on recovering, found himself seated on a velvet sofa, in the most magnificent room he had ever seen, lighted with innumerable tapers, in lustres of pure crystal. A sumptuous banquet was set in the middle. The doors opening to soft music, a lady of incomparable beauty, attired with amazing splendor, entered, surrounded by a troop of gay nymphs far more fair than the Graces. She advanced to the knight, and falling on her knees thanked him as her deliverer. The nymphs placed a garland of laurel on his head, and the lady led him by the hand to the banquet, and sat beside him. The nymphs placed themselves at the table, and a numerous train of servants entering, served up the feast, delicious music playing all the time. Sir Bertrand could not speak for astonishment. He could only return their honors by courteous looks and gestures. After the banquet was finished, all retired but the lady, who leading back the knight to the sofa, addressed him in these words. 1773. 9. The fragment ends here. William Beckford. Beckford's Vathek is regularly mentioned in discussions of Gothic romance, though its setting is Arabian rather than European, and its exquisitely detailed architecture is futuristic rather than imitation medieval. It also has more incongruity of tone-suppressed comedy along with melodramatic high seriousness than the other works included in this section. It is Gothic, that is, in the way the Rocky Horror Picture Show is Gothic. Vathek was written in French at a single sitting of 3 days and 2 nights, according to the Dictionary of National Biography, and then published in English translation as an Arabian tale, from an unpublished manuscript, 1786. Byron was an enthusiastic admirer, drawing on the book extensively for his Eastern tale The Giaour, 1813. Besides Vathek, Beckford, 1760–1844, was known in his time for building one of the most extraordinary and eccentric structures in the history of architecture, Fonthill Abbey, Beckford's Gothic palace, which he furnished with rare books, medieval, Islamic, and East Asian art, and other curiosities. Beckford endowed the Caliph Vathek with his own zeal for collecting, making him another connoisseur of the strange, as well as a tyrant who puts people, even little children, to death at the slightest whim. Sated with even these unorthodox pleasures, Vathek sets out in the course of Beckford's tale to find the city of Istakar and the treasures of the pre-Adamite sultans. In the extract we have selected from the final pages, he and his favorite companion, Nuradihar, daughter of the Emir Fakhreddin, arrive at the mountain surrounding Istakar and, with the guidance of the Giaour, an evil magician, enter the underground realm of Ebli, Prince of Darkness. They achieve their quest but are doomed to suffer the agony of eternally burning hearts and, what seems even worse, the cessation of communion with anything outside their separate selves. For discussion of the exotic geography of Beckford's fantasy, see Romantic Orientalism at Norton Literature Online. From Vathek. A death-like stillness reigned over the mountain, and through the air. The moon dilated, on a vast platform, the shades of the lofty columns, which reached from the terrace almost to the clouds. The gloomy watchtowers, whose number bears could not be counted, were veiled by no roof, and their capitals, of an architecture unknown in the records of the earth, served as an asylum for the birds of darkness, which, alarmed at the approach of such visitants, fled away croaking. The chief of the eunuchs, trembling with fear, besought Vathek that a fire might be kindled. No, replied he, there is no time left to think of such trifles, abide where thou art, and expect my commands. Having thus spoken, he presented his hand to Nuradihar, and, ascending the steps of a vast staircase, reached the terrace, which was flagged with squares of marble, and resembled a smooth expanse of water, upon whose surface not a leaf ever dared to vegetate. On the right rose the watchtowers, ranged before the ruins of an immense palace, whose walls were embossed with various figures. In front stood forth the colossal forms of 4 creatures, composed of the leopard and the griffin, and, though but of stone, inspired emotions of terror. Near these were distinguished, by the splendor of the moon, which streamed full on the place, characters like those on the sabers of the Giaour, that possess the same virtue of changing every moment. These, after vacillating for some time, at last fixed in Arabic letters, and prescribed to the Caliph the following words: Vathek, thou hast violated the conditions of my parchment, and deservest to be sent back, but, in favor to thy companion, and as the meed for what thou hast done to obtain it, Ebli permitteth that the portal of his palace shall be opened, and the subterranean fire will receive thee into the number of its adorers. He scarcely had read these words before the mountain, against which the terrace was reared, trembled, and the watchtowers were ready to topple headlong upon them. The rock yawned, and disclosed within it a staircase of polished marble that seemed to approach the abyss. Upon each stair were planted 2 large torches, like those Nuranihar had seen in her vision, the camphorated vapor ascending from which gathered into a cloud under the hollow of the vault. This appearance, instead of terrifying, gave new courage to the daughter of Fakhreddin. Scarcely deigning to bid adieu to the moon and the firmament, she abandoned without hesitation the pure atmosphere, to plunge into these infernal exhalations. The gait of those impious personages was haughty and determined. As they descended, by the effulgence of the torches, they gazed on each other with mutual admiration, and both appeared so resplendent that they already esteemed themselves spiritual intelligences. The only circumstance that perplexed them was their not arriving at the bottom of the stairs. On hastening their descent with an ardent impetuosity, they felt their steps accelerated to such a degree that they seemed not walking, but falling from a precipice. Their progress, however, was at length impeded by a vast portal of ebony, which the Caliph, without difficulty, recognized. Here the Jawar awaited them, with the key in his hand. "Ye are welcome," said he to them, with a ghastly smile, "in spite of Muhammad, and all his dependents. I will now admit you into that palace where you have so highly merited a place." Whilst he was uttering these words, he touched the enameled lock with his key, and the doors at once expanded, with a noise still louder than the thunder of mountains, and as suddenly recoiled the moment they had entered. The Caliph and Nuranihar beheld each other with amazement, at finding themselves in a place which, though roofed with a vaulted ceiling, was so spacious and lofty that at first they took it for an immeasurable plain. But their eyes at length growing familiar to the grandeur of the objects at hand, they extended their view to those at a distance, and discovered rows of columns and arcades, which gradually diminished, till they terminated in a point, radiant as the sun, when he darts his last beams athwart the ocean. The pavement, strewed over with gold dust and saffron, exhaled so subtle an odor as almost overpowered them. They, however, went on, and observed an infinity of censers, in which ambergris and the wood of aloes were continually burning. Between the several columns were placed tables, each spread with a profusion of viands, and wines of every species, sparkling in vases of crystal. A throng of genii, and other fantastic spirits, of each sex danced lasciviously in troops, at the sound of music which issued from beneath. In the midst of this immense hall, a vast multitude was incessantly passing, who severally kept their right hands on their hearts, without once regarding anything around them. They had, all, the livid paleness of death. Their eyes, deep sunk in their sockets, resembled those phosphoric meteors that glimmer by night in places of interment. Some stalked slowly on, absorbed in profound reverie, some, shrieking with agony, ran furiously about, like tigers wounded with poisoned arrows, whilst others, grinding their teeth in rage, foamed along, more frantic than the wildest maniac. They all avoided each other, and, though surrounded by a multitude that no one could number, each wandered at random, unheedful of the rest, as if alone on a desert which no foot had trodden. Vathek and Nuranihar, frozen with terror at a sight so baleful, demanded of the Jawar what these appearances might mean, and why these ambulating spectres never withdrew their hands from their hearts. "Perplex not yourselves," replied he bluntly, "with so much at once, you will soon be acquainted with all. Let us haste, and present you to Ebli." They continued their way through the multitude, but, notwithstanding their confidence at first, they were not sufficiently composed to examine, with attention, the various perspectives of halls and of galleries that opened on the right hand and left, which were all illuminated by torches and braziers, whose flames rose in pyramids to the center of the vault. At length they came to a place where long curtains, brocade with crimson and gold, fell from all parts in striking confusion. Here the choirs and dances were heard no longer. The light which glimmered came from afar. After some time, Vathek and Nuranihar perceived a gleam brightening through the drapery, and entered a vast tabernacle, carpeted with the skins of leopards. An infinity of elders with streaming beards, and afrits registered in complete armor, had prostrated themselves before the ascent of a lofty eminence, on the top of which, upon a globe of fire, sat the formidable Ebli. His person was that of a young man, whose noble and regular features seemed to have been tarnished by malignant vapors. In his large eyes appeared both pride and despair, his flowing hair retained some resemblance to that of an angel of light. In his hand, which thunder had blasted, he swayed the iron scepter that causes the monster Auranabad, the afrits, and all the powers of the abyss to tremble. At his presence, the heart of the Caliph sunk within him, and, for the first time, he fell prostrate on his face. Nuranihar, however, though greatly dismayed, could not help admiring the person of Ebs, for she expected to have seen some stupendous giant. Ebli, with a voice more mild than might be imagined, but such as transfused through the soul the deepest melancholy, said, "Creatures of clay, I receive you into mine empire, ye are numbered amongst my adorers, enjoy whatever this palace affords, the treasures of the pre-Adamite sultans, their bickering sabers, and those talismans that compel the dives asterisk to open the subterranean expanses of the mountain of Kaf, which communicate with these. There, insatiable as your curiosity may be, shall you find sufficient to gratify it? You shall possess the exclusive privilege of entering the fortress of Herman, and the halls of Argent, where are portrayed all creatures endowed with intelligence, and the various animals that inhabited that earth prior to the creation of that contemptible being, whom ye denominate the father of mankind as Vathek and Nuranihar, feeling themselves revived and encouraged by this harangue, eagerly said to the Jawar, "Bring us instantly to the place which contains these precious talismans." "Come," answered this wicked dive, with his malignant grin, "come, and possess all that my sovereign hath promised, and more." He then conducted them into a long aisle adjoining the tabernacle, preceding them with hasty steps, and followed by his disciples with the utmost alacrity. They reached, at length, a hall of great extent, and covered with a lofty dome, around which appeared 50 portals of bronze, secured with as many fastenings of iron. A funereal gloom prevailed over the whole scene. Here, upon 2 beds of incorruptible cedar, lay recumbent the fleshless forms of the pre-Adamite kings, who had been monarchs of the whole earth. They still possessed enough of life to be conscious of their deplorable condition. Their eyes retained a melancholy motion, they regarded each other with looks of the deepest dejection, each holding his right hand, motionless, on his heart. At their feet were inscribed the events of their several reigns, their power, their pride, and their crimes, Solomon Rod, Solomon Daki, and Solomon Digian Benjian, who, after having chained up the dives in the dark caverns of Kaf, became so presumptuous as to doubt of the supreme power. All these maintained great state, though not to be compared with the eminence of Solomon ben Daud. This king, so renowned for his wisdom, was on the loftiest elevation, and placed immediately under the dome. He appeared to possess more animation than the rest. Though from time to time he labored with profound sighs, and, like his companions, kept his right hand on his heart, yet his countenance was more composed, and he seemed to be listening to the sullen roar of a vast cataract, visible in part through the grated portals. This was the only sound that intruded on the silence of these doleful mansions. A range of brazen vases surrounded this elevation. Remove the covers from these cabalistic deposing. Teres, said the Giaour to Vathek, and avail thyself of the talismans, which will break asunder all these gates of bronze, and not only render thee master of the treasures contained within them, but also of the spirits by which they are guarded. The Caliph, whom this ominous preliminary had entirely disconcerted, approached the vases with faltering footsteps, and was ready to sink with terror when he heard the groans of Solomon. As he proceeded, a voice from the livid lips of the prophet articulated these words: "In my lifetime, I filled a magnificent throne, having on my right hand 12,000 seats of gold, where the patriarchs and the prophets heard my doctrines, on my left the sages and doctors, upon as many thrones of silver, were present at all my decisions. Whilst I thus administered justice to innumerable multitudes, the birds of the air, liberting over me, served as a canopy from the rays of the sun. My people flourished, and my palace rose to the clouds. I erected a temple to the Most High, which was the wonder of the universe, but I basely suffered myself to be seduced by the love of women, and a curiosity that could not be restrained by sublunary things. I listened to the counsels of Ahriman and the daughter of Pharaoh, and adored fire and the hosts of heaven. I forsook the holy city, and commanded the genii to rear the stupendous palace of Istakar, and the turrets of the watchtowers, each of which was consecrated to a star. There, for a while, I enjoyed myself, in the zenith of glory and pleasure. Not only men, but supernatural existences were subject also to my will. I began to think, as these unhappy monarchs around had already thought, that the vengeance of heaven was asleep, when at once the thunder burst my structures asunder, and precipitated me hither, where, however, I do not remain, like the other inhabitants, totally destitute of hope, for an angel of light hath revealed that, in consideration of the piety of my early youth, my woes shall come to an end when this cataract shall forever cease to flow. Till then, I am in torments, ineffable torments. An unrelenting fire preys on my heart." Having uttered this exclamation, Solomon raised his hands towards heaven, in token of supplication, and the Caliph discerned through his bosom, which was transparent as crystal, his heart enveloped in flames. At a sight so full of horror Nuradihar fell back, like one petrified, into the arms of Vathek, who cried out with a convulsive sob, "O Giaour! Whither hast thou brought us? Allow us to depart, and I will relinquish all thou hast promised. O Muhammad! Remains there no more mercy?" "None. None," replied the malicious Dive. "No, miserable prince. Thou art now in the abode of vengeance and despair. Thy heart also will be kindled, like those of the other votaries of Ebli. A few days are allotted thee, previous to this fatal period, employ them as thou wilt, recline on these heaps of gold, command the infernal potentates, range, at thy pleasure, through these immense subterranean domains, no barrier shall be shut against thee. As for me, I have fulfilled my mission, I now leave thee to thyself." At these words, he vanished. The Caliph and Nuradihar remained in the most abject affliction. Their tears unable to flow, scarcely could they support themselves. At length, taking each other despondingly by the hand, they went faltering from this fatal hall, indifferent which way they turned their steps. Every portal opened at their approach. The Dives fell prostrate before them. Every reservoir of riches was disclosed to their view, but they no longer felt the incentives of curiosity, pride, or avarice. With like apathy they heard the chorus of genii, and saw the stately banquets prepared to regale them. They went wandering on, from chamber to chamber, hall to hall, and gallery to gallery, all without bounds or limit, all distinguishable by the same lowering gloom, all adorned with the same awful grandeur, all traversed by persons in search of repose and consolation, but who sought them in vain, for every one carried within him a heart tormented in flames. Shunned by these various sufferers, who seemed, by their looks, to be upbraiding the partners of their guild, they withdrew from them, to wait in direful suspense the moment which should render them to each other the like objects of terror. 1786. Anne Radcliffe. The great enchantress, Radcliffe, 1764–1823, published 5 novels between 1789 and 1797 and a sixth posthumously in 1826, most of them tremendously popular and influential on other writers for long afterward. She shunned fame and lived in seclusion, so little was known of her that, seeking to explain the long interval between the Italian in 1797 and Gaston de Blondeville in 1826, contemporaries gossiped that Radcliffe had at last gone mad from too much imagining and had spent her final decades confined in an asylum. The rumor was without basis, but the fate it assigned to Radcliffe is the fate most feared by her heroines, who cling valiantly to reason, but who are plunged into worlds of nightmarish mystery where nothing is as it seems and where reason, at least initially, does not get them very far. A Radcliffean heroine, like Radcliffe's reader, is kept on the rack of suspense by a succession of inexplicable sights and sounds that tempt her to believe that supernatural events really do happen. The ancient castle in which she is confined, the site of these mysteries, is often located in some wilderness that the forces of law have abandoned and that has become the haunt of mercenary soldiers and picaresque bandits. For all its strangeness, however, this place frequently turns out to be a version of the heroine's long-lost home, just as her tyrannical persecutors turn out to be closely allied with the fathers, uncles, and priests who are supposed to be a young lady's protectors. Our first extract is taken from Radcliffe's third novel, The Romance of the Forest, 1791. In this episode, later remembered by Jane Austen as she recounted the story of the first eventful night that Catherine Morland spends as a guest at Northanger Abbey, the orphaned Adeline sets out, detective-like, to solve a mystery. The second extract is from Radcliffe's masterpiece, The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, one of her signature pieces of dreamy landscape description, representing Emily St. Aubert's reactions as she and her villainous guardian Montoni approach his castle high in the Italian Apennines. From The Romance of the Forest. From Chapter 8. Adeline retired early to her room, which adjoined on one side to Madame Lamotte's, and on the other to the closet formerly mentioned. It was spacious and lofty, and what little furniture it contained was falling to decay, but, perhaps, the present tone of her spirits might contribute more than these circumstances to give that air of melancholy which seemed to reign in it. She was unwilling to go to bed, lest the dreams that had lately pursued her should return, and determined to sit up till she found herself oppressed by sleep, when it was probable her rest would be profound. She placed the light on a small table, and, taking a book, continued to read for above an hour, till her mind refused any longer to abstract itself from its own cares, and she sat for some time leaning pensively on her arm. The wind was high, and as it whistled through the desolate apartment, and shook the feeble doors, she often started, and sometimes even thought she heard sighs between the pauses of the gust, but she checked these illusions, which the hour of the night and her own melancholy imagination conspired to raise. As she sat musing, her eyes fixed on the opposite wall, she perceived the arras, with which the room was hung, wave backwards and forwards. She continued to observe it for some minutes, and then rose to examine it farther. It was moved by the wind, and she blushed at the momentary fear it had excited, but she observed that the tapestry was more strongly agitated in one particular place than elsewhere, and a noise that seemed something more than that of the wind issued thence. The old bedstead, which Lamotte had found in this apartment, had been removed to accommodate Adeline, and it was behind the place where this had stood that the wind seemed to rush with particular force. Curiosity prompted her to examine still farther. She felt about the tapestry, and perceiving the wall behind shake under her hand, she lifted the arras, and discovered a small door, whose loosened hinges admitted the wind, and occasioned the noise she had heard. The door was held only by a bolt. Having undrawn which, and brought the light, she descended by a few steps into another chamber. She instantly remembered her dreams. The chamber was not much like that in which she had seen the dying Chevalier, and afterwards the bier, but it gave her a confused remembrance of one through which she had passed. Holding up the light to examine it more fully, she was convinced by its structure that it was part of the ancient foundation. A shattered casement, placed high from the floor, seemed to be the only opening to admit light. She observed a door on the opposite side of the apartment, and after some moments of hesitation, gained courage, and determined to pursue the inquiry. A mystery seems to hang over these chambers, said she, which it is, perhaps, my lot to develop. I will, at least, see to what that door leads. She stepped forward, and having unclosed it, proceeded with faltering steps along a suite of apartments resembling the first in style and condition, and terminating in one exactly like that where her dream had represented the dying person. The remembrance struck so forcibly upon her imagination that she was in danger of fainting, and looking round the room, almost expected to see the phantom of her dream. Unable to quit the place, she sat down on some old lumber to recover herself, while her spirits were nearly overcome by a superstitious dread, such as she had never felt before. She wondered to what part of the abbey these chambers belonged, and that they had so long escaped detection. The casements were all too high to afford any information from without. When she was sufficiently composed to consider the direction of the rooms, and the situation of the abbey, there appeared not a doubt that they formed an interior part of the original building. As these reflections passed over her mind, a sudden gleam of moonlight fell upon some object without the casement. Being now sufficiently composed to wish to pursue the inquiry, and believing this object might afford her some means of learning the situation of these rooms, she combated her remaining terrors, and, in order to distinguish it more clearly, removed the light to an outer chamber, but before she could return, a heavy cloud was driven over the face of the moon, and all without was perfectly dark. She stood for some moments waiting a returning gleam, but the obscurity continued. As she went softly back for the light, her foot stumbled over something on the floor, and while she stooped to examine it, the moon again shone, so that she could distinguish, through the casement, the eastern towers of the abbey. This discovery confirmed her former conjectures concerning the interior situation of these apartments. The obscurity of the place prevented her discovering what it was that had impeded her steps, but having brought the light forward, she perceived on the floor an old dagger. With a trembling hand she took it up, and upon a closer view perceived that it was spotted and stained with rust. Shocked and surprised, she looked round the room for some object that might confirm or destroy the dreadful suspicion which now rushed upon her mind, but she saw only a great chair, with broken arms, that stood in one corner of the room, and a table in a condition equally shattered, except that in another part lay a confused heap of things, which appeared to be old lumber. She went up to it, and perceived a broken bedstead, with some decayed remnants of furniture, covered with dust and cobwebs, and which seemed, indeed, as if they had not been moved for many years. Desirous, however, of examining Tartar, she attempted to raise what appeared to have been part of the bedstead, but it slipped from her hand, and, rolling to the floor, brought with it some of the remaining lumber. Adeline started aside and saved herself, and when the noise it made had ceased, she heard a small rustling sound, and as she was about to leave the chamber, saw something falling gently among the lumber. It was a small roll of paper, tied with a string, and covered with dust. Adeline took it up, and on opening it perceived an handwriting. She attempted to read it, but the part of the manuscript she looked at was so much obliterated that she found this difficult, though what few words were legible impressed her with curiosity and terror, and induced her to return immediately to her chamber. 1791. From the Mysteries of Udolpho. From Volume 2, Chapter 5. Towards the close of day, the road wound into a deep valley. Mountains, whose shaggy steeps appeared to be inaccessible, almost surrounded it. To the east, a vista opened, that exhibited the Apennines in their darkest horrors, and the long perspective of retiring summits, rising over each other, their ridges clothed with pines, exhibited a stronger image of grandeur than any that Emily had yet seen. The sun had just sunk below the top of the mountains she was descending, whose long shadow stretched athwart the valley, but his sloping rays, shooting through an opening of the cliffs, touched with a yellow gleam the summits of the forest, that hung upon the opposite steeps, and streamed in full splendor upon the towers and battlements of a castle, that spread its extensive ramparts along the brow of a precipice above. The splendor of these illumined objects was heightened by the contrasted shade, which involved the valley below. There, said Montoni, speaking for the first time in several hours, is Udolpho. Emily gazed with melancholy awe upon the castle, which she understood to be Montoni's, for, though it was now lighted up by the setting sun, the Gothic greatness of its features, and its mouldering walls of dark grey stone, rendered it a gloomy and sublime object. As she gazed, the light died away on its walls, leaving a melancholy purple tint, which spread deeper and deeper, as the thin vapor crept up the mountain, while the battlements above were still tipped with splendor. From those two, the rays soon faded, and the whole edifice was invested with the solemn duskiness of evening. Silent, lonely, and sublime, it seemed to stand the sovereign of the scene, and to frown defiance on all who dared to invade its solitary reign. As the twilight deepened, its features became more awful in obscurity, and Emily continued to gaze, till its clustering towers were alone seen, rising over the tops of the woods, beneath whose thick shade the carriages soon after began to ascend. The extent and darkness of these tall woods awakened terrific images in her mind, and she almost expected to see banditti start up from under the trees. At length, the carriages emerged upon a heathy rock, and, soon after, reached the castle gates, where the deep tone of the portal bell, which was struck upon to give notice of their arrival, increased the fearful emotions that had assailed Emily. While they waited till the servant within should come to open the gates, she anxiously surveyed the edifice, but the gloom that overspread it allowed her to distinguish little more than a part of its outline, with the massy walls of the ramparts, and to know that it was vast, ancient, and dreary. From the parts she saw, she judged of the heavy strength and extent of the whole. The gateway before her, leading into the courts, was of gigantic size, and was defended by two round towers, crowned by overhanging turrets, embattled, where instead of banners, now waved long grass and wild plants, that had taken root among the mouldering stones, and which seemed to sigh, as the breeze rolled past, over the desolation around them. The towers were united by a curtain, pierced and embattled also, below which appeared the pointed arch of a huge portcullis, surmounting the gates. From these, the walls of the ramparts extended to other towers, overlooking the precipice, whose shattered outline, appearing on a gleam that lingered in the west, told of the ravages of war. Beyond these all was lost in the obscurity of evening. While Emily gazed with awe upon the scene, footsteps were heard within the gates, and the undrawing of the bolts, after which an ancient servant of the castle appeared, forcing back the huge folds of the portal, to admit his lord. As the carriage wheels rolled heavily under the portcullis, Emily's heart sunk, and she seemed as if she was going into her prison, the gloomy court, into which she passed served to confirm the idea, and her imagination, ever awake to circumstance, suggested even more terrors than her reason could justify. 1794. Matthew Gregory Lewis. Lewis is the Monk, published in 1796 when the author was 20, is the most gory of the Gothic novels and one of the most vividly written, a combination guaranteed to produce a bestseller. Lewis, 1775-1818, appears to have been alarmed by the scandal that erupted when his authorship was revealed, but not so rattled as to alter his literary course. He went on to compose Gothic dramas for the stage and, finding new uses for the language skills honed during the education that was meant to have prepared him for a diplomatic career, played a major part in introducing German tales of terror to England. In The Monk, Ambrosio, abbot of a monastery in Madrid, goes from a pinnacle of self-satisfied saintliness to become one of the most depraved villains in all fiction, both an incestuous rapist and matricidal murderer. After being seduced by Matilda, a female demon who has entered his monastery disguised as a male novice named Rosario, Ambrosio, with the help of a talisman that Matilda provides, plots the rape of one of his penitents, Antonia. Within the Monk, mob violence competes with Ambrosio's bloodlust as a source for horror, suggesting how Gothic stories, even when set in distant pasts and places, may have allowed the readers and writers of the 1790s to work through timely anxieties about the power of crowds and the threat of revolution. In the first extract given here, Ambrosio exults in private after having delivered a spellbinding sermon to a packed church in Madrid. The second extract recounts his assault on Antonia and the discovery by her mother, Elvira, of the young woman's peril. From the Monk. From Chapter 2. The monks having attended their abbot to the door of his cell, he dismissed them with an air of conscious superiority, in which humility's semblance combated with the reality of pride. He was no sooner alone, than he gave free loose to the indulgence of his vanity. When he remembered the enthusiasm which his discourse had excited, his heart swelled with rapture, and his imagination presented him with splendid visions of aggrandizement. He looked round him with exultation, and pride told him loudly that he was superior to the rest of his fellow creatures. Who, thought he, who but myself has passed the ordeal of youth, yet sees no single stain upon his conscience? Who else has subdued the violence of strong passions and an impetuous temperament, and submitted even from the dawn of life to voluntary retirement? I seek for such a man in vain. I see no one but myself possessed of such resolution. Religion cannot boast Ambrosios equal. How powerful an effect did my discourse produce upon its auditors! How they crowded round me! How they loaded me with benedictions, and pronounced me the sole uncorrupted pillar of the church! What then now is left for me to do? Nothing, but to watch as carefully over the conduct of my brethren, as I have hitherto watched over my own. Yet hold. May I not be tempted from those paths which till now I have pursued without one moment's wandering? Am I not a man whose nature is frail and prone to error? I must now abandon the solitude of my retreat. The fairest and noblest dames of Madrid continually present themselves at the abbey, and will use no other confessor. I must accustom my eyes to objects of temptation, and expose myself to the seduction of luxury and desire. Should I meet in that world which I am constrained to enter, some lovely female lovely as you, Madonna? As he said this, he fixed his eyes upon a picture of the Virgin, which was suspended opposite to him. This for 2 years had been the object of his increasing wonder and adoration. He paused, and gazed upon it with delight. What beauty in that countenance, he continued after a silence of some minutes. How graceful is the turn of that head! What sweetness, yet what majesty in her divine eyes! How softly her cheek reclines upon her hand! Can the rose be with the blush of that cheek? Can the lily rival the whiteness of that hand? Oh! If such a creature existed, and existed but for me! Were I permitted to twine round my fingers those golden ringlets, and press with my lips the treasures of that snowy bosom! Gracious God, should I then resist the temptation? Should I not barter for a single embrace the reward of my sufferings for 30 years? Should I not abandon, fool that I am? Whither do I suffer my admiration of this picture to hurry me? Away, impure ideas! Let me remember that woman is forever lost to me. Never was mortal form so perfect as this picture. But even did such exist, the trial might be too mighty for a common virtue, but Ambrosios is proof against temptation. Temptation? Did I say? To me it would be none. What charms me, when I deal and concede, erred as a superior being, would disgust me, become woman and tainted with all the failings of mortality. It is not the woman's beauty that fills me with such enthusiasm, it is the painter's skill that I admire, it is the divinity that I adore. Are not the passions dead in my bosom? Have I not freed myself from the frailty of mankind? Fear not, Ambrosio. Take confidence in the strength of our virtue. Enter boldly into the world, to whose failings you are superior, reflect that you are now exempted from humanity's defects, and defy all the arts of the spirits of darkness. They shall know you for what you are. Here his reverie was interrupted by 3 soft knocks at the door of his cell. With difficulty did the abbot awake from his delirium. The knocking was repeated. Who is there? Said Ambrosio at length. It is only Rosario, replied a gentle voice. From Chapter 8. It was almost 2 o'clock before the lustful monk ventured to bend his steps towards Antonia's dwelling. It has been already mentioned that the abbey was at no great distance from the Strada di San Iago. He reached the house unobserved. Here he stopped, and hesitated for a moment. He reflected on the enormity of the crime, the consequences of a discovery, and the probability, after what had passed, of Elvira suspecting him to be her daughter's ravisher. On the other hand, it was suggested that she could do no more than suspect, that no proofs of his guilt could be produced, that it would seem impossible for the rape to have been committed without Antonia's knowing when, where, or by whom, and finally, he believed that his fame was too firmly established to be shaken by the unsupported accusations of two unknown women. This latter argument was perfectly false. He knew not how uncertain is the air of popular applause, and that a moment suffices to make him today the debts Tashin of the world, who yesterday was its idol. The result of the monk's deliberatians was that he should proceed in his enterprise. He ascended the steps leading to the house. No sooner did he touch the door with the silver myrtle than it flew open, and presented him with a free passage. He entered, and the door closed after him of its own accord. Guided by the moonbeams, he proceeded up the staircase with slow and cautious steps. He looked round him every moment with apprehension and anxiety. He saw a spy in every shadow, and heard a voice in every murmur of the night breeze. Consciousness of the guilty business on which he was employed appalled his heart, and rendered it more timid than a woman's. Yet, still he proceeded. He reached the door of Antonia's chamber. He stopped, and listened. All was hushed within. The total silence persuaded him that his intended victim was retired to rest, and he ventured to lift up the latch. The door was fastened, and resisted his efforts. But no sooner was it touched by the talisman than the bolt flew back. The ravisher stepped on, and found himself in the chamber where slept the innocent girl, unconscious how dangerous a visitor was drawing near her couch. The door closed after him, and the bolt shot again into its fastening. Ambrosio advanced with precaution. He took care that not a board should creak under his foot, and held in his breath as he approached the bed. His first attention was to perform the magic ceremony. As Matilda had charged him, he breathed thrice upon the silver myrtle, pronounced over it Antonia's name, and laid it upon her pillow. The effects which it had already produced permitted not his doubting its success in prolonging the slumbers of his devoted mistress. No sooner was the enchantment performed than he conceived her to be absolutely in his power, and his eyes flashed with lust and impatience. He now ventured to cast a glance upon the sleeping beauty. A single lamp, burning before the statue of Saint Rosalia, shed a faint light through the room, and permitted him to examine all the charms of the lovely object before him. The heat of the weather had obliged her to throw off part of the bedclothes. Those which still covered her Ambrosio's insolent hand hastened to remove. She lay with her cheek reclining upon one ivory arm, the other rested on the side of the bed with graceful indolence. A few tresses of her hair had escaped from beneath the muslin which confined the rest, and fell carelessly over her bosom, as it heaved with slow and regular suspiration. The warm air had spread her cheek with a higher color than usual. A smile inexpressibly sweet played round her ripe and coral lips, from which every now and then escaped a gentle sigh, or an half-pronounced sentence. An air of enchanting innocence and candor pervaded her whole form, and there was a sort of modesty in her very nakedness, which added fresh stings to the desires of the lustful monk. He remained for some moments devouring those charms with his eyes which soon were to be subjected to his ill-regulated passions. Her mouth half open seemed to solicit a kiss. He bent over her, he joined his lips to hers, and drew in the fragrance of her breath with rapture. This momentary pleasure increased his longing for still greater. His desires were raised to that frantic height by which brutes are agitated. He resolved not to delay for one instant longer the accomplishment of his wishes, and hastily proceeded to tear off those garments which impeded the gratification of his lust. "Gracious God," exclaimed a voice behind him, "am I not deceived? Is not this an illusion?" Terror, confusion, and disappointment accompanied these words, as they struck Ambrosio's hearing. He started, and turned towards it. Elvira stood at the door of the chamber, and regarded the monk with looks of surprise and detestation. A frightful dream had represented to her Antonia on the verge of a precipice. She saw her trembling on the brink, every moment seemed to threaten her fall, and she heard her exclaim with shrieks, "Save me, mother! Save me, yet a moment, and it will be too late." Elvira woke in terror. The vision had made too strong an impression upon her mind to permit her resting till assured of her daughter's safety. She hastily started from her bed, threw on a loose nightgown, and, passing through the closet in which slept the waiting woman, reached Antonia's chamber just in time to rescue her from the grasp of the ravisher. His shame and her amazement seemed to have petrified into statues both Elvira and the monk. They remained gazing upon each other in silence. The lady was the first to recover herself. "It is no dream," she cried, "it is really Ambrosio who stands before me. It is the man whom Madrid esteems a saint that I find at this late hour near the couch of my unhappy child. Monster of hypocrisy! I already suspected your designs, but forbore your accusation in pity to human frailty. Silence would now be criminal. The whole city shall be informed of your incontinence. I will unmask you, villain, and convince the church what a viper she cherishes in her bosom." Pale and confused, the baffled culprit stood trembling before her. He would fain have extenuated his offense, but could find no apology for his conduct. He could produce nothing but broken sentences, and excuses which contradict each other. Elvira was too justly incensed to grant the pardon which he requested. She protested that she would raise the neighborhood, and make him an example to all future hypocrites. Then hastening to the bed, she called to Antonia to wake, and finding that her voice had no effect, she took her arm, and raised her forcibly from the pillow. The charm operated too powerfully. Antonia remained insensible, and, on being released by her mother, sank back upon the pillow. "This slumber cannot be natural," cried the amazed Elvira, whose indignation increased with every moment. "Some mystery is concealed in it. But trembly, hypocrite! All your villainy shall soon be unraveled. Help! Help!" she exclaimed aloud, within there. "Flora! Floral, hear me for one moment, lady," cried the monk, restored to himself by the urgency of the danger. "By all that is sacred and holy, I swear that your daughter's honor is still unviolated. Forgive my transgression. Spare me the shame of a discovery, and permit me to regain the abbey undisturbed. Grant me this request in mercy. I promise not only that Antonia shall be secure from me in future, but that the rest of my life shall prove." Elvira interrupted him abruptly. "Antonia secure from you? I will secure her. You shall betray no longer the confidence of parents. Your iniquity shall be unveiled to the public eye. All Madrid shall shudder at your perfidy, your hypocrisy, and incontinence. What ho! There! Flora! Flora! I say." While she spoke thus, the remembrance of Agnes struck upon his mind. Thus had she sued to him for mercy, and thus had he refused her prayer. It was now his turn to suffer, and he could not but acknowledge that his punishment was just. In the meanwhile Elvira continued to call Flora to her assistance, but her voice was so choked with passion, that the servant, who was buried in profound slumber, was insensible to all her cries. Elvira dared not go towards the closet in which Flora slept, lest the monk should take that opportunity to escape. Such indeed was his intention. He trusted that, could he reach the abbey unobserved by any other than Elvira, her single testimony would not suffice to ruin a reputation so well established as his was in Madrid. With this idea he gathered up such garments as he had already thrown off, and hastened towards the door. Elvira was aware of his design. She followed him, and, ere he could draw back the bolt, seized him by the arm, and detained him. "Attempt not to fly," said she, "you quit not this room without witnesses of your guilt." Ambrosio struggled in vain to disengage himself. Elvira quitted not her hold, but redoubled her cries for succor. The friar's danger grew more urgent. He expected every moment to hear people assembling at her voice, and, worked up to madness by the approach of ruin, he adopted a resolution equally desperate and savage. Turning round suddenly, with one hand he grasped Elvira's throat so as to prevent her continuing her clamour, and with the other, dashing her violently upon the ground, he dragged her towards the bed. Confused by this unexpected attack, she scarcely had power to strive at forcing herself from his grasp, while the monk, snatching the pillow from beneath her daughter's head, covering with it Elvira's face, and pressing his knee upon her stomach with all his strength, endeavored to put an end to her existence. He succeeded but too well. Her natural strength increased by the excess of anguish. Long did the sufferer struggle to disengage herself, but in vain. The monk continued to kneel upon her breast, witnessed without mercy the convulsive trembling of her limbs beneath him, and sustained with inhuman firmness the spectacle of her agonies when soul and body were on the point of separating. Those agonies at length were over. She ceased to struggle for life. The monk took off the pillow, and gazed upon her. Her face was covered with a frightful blackness, her limbs moved no more, the blood was chilled in her veins, her heart had forgotten to beat, and her hands were stiff and frozen. Ambrosio beheld before him that once noble and majestic form, now become a coarse, cold, senseless, and disgusting. This horrible act was no sooner perpetrated, than the friar beheld the enormity of his crime. A cold dew flowed over his limbs, his eyes closed, he staggered to a chair, and sank into it almost as lifeless as the unfortunate who lay extended at his feet. From this state he was roused by the necessity of flight, and the danger of being found in Antonia's apartment. He had no desire to profit by the execution of his crime. Antonia now appeared to him an object of disgust. A deadly cold had usurped the place of that warmth which glowed in his bosom. No ideas offered themselves to his mind but those of death and guilt, of present shame and future punishment. Agitated by remorse and fear, he prepared for flight, yet his terrors did not so completely master his recollection as to prevent his taking the precautions necessary for his safety. He replaced the pillow upon the bed, gathered up his garments, and, with the fatal talisman in his hand, bent his unsteady steps towards the door. Bewildered by fear, he fancied that his flight was opposed by legions of phantoms. Wherever he turned, the disfigured corse seemed to lie in his passage, and it was long before he succeeded in reaching the door. 1795–1796. Anonymous. The following discussion of the fashion for tales of terror appeared in the Spint of the Public Journal S for 1797. Its wonderfully scathing humor aside, it is typical of the many Romantic period commentaries that argued that the popularity of this new style of novel was a frightening symptom of literature's commercialization and of culture's degradation. The recipe with which the anonymous author concludes the squib, and which makes the point that best-selling fiction is likely to be, in a precise sense, formula fiction, is a frequent feature of satires on novelists. Coleridge, who in our next extract refers to novels as manufactures, i.e., as things produced mechanically rather than as works that authors compose, elsewhere wrote his own recipes for Radcliffe romances and for Walter Scott poems. Also notable is the author's tacit suggestion that the political climate has helped make terror the order of the day. That phrase appeared in the directive that was issued in September 1793 by Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety and that inaugurated the bloodiest chapter of the revolution in France. Terrorist novel writing. Never complain of fashion, when it is confined to externals, to the form of a cap, or the cut of a lapel, to the color of a wig, or the tune of a ballad, but when I perceive that there is such a thing as fashion even in composing books, it is, perhaps, full time that some attempt should be made to recall writers to the old boundaries of common sense. I allude, sir, principally to the great quantity of novels with which our circulating libraries are filled, and our parlor tables covered, in which it has been the fashion to make terror the order of the day, by confining the heroes and heroines in old gloomy castles, full of specters, apparitions, ghosts, and dead men's bones. This is now so common, that a novelist blushes to bring about a marriage by ordinary means, but conducts the happy pair through long and dangerous galleries, where the light burns blue, the thunder rattles, and the great window at the end presents the hideous visage of a murdered man, uttering piercing groans, and developing shocking mysteries. If a curtain is withdrawn, there is a bleeding body behind it. If a chest is opened, it contains a skeleton. If a noise is heard, somebody is receiving a deadly blow, and if a candle goes out, its place is sure to be supplied by a flash of lightning. Cold hands grasp us in the dark, statues are seen to move, and suits of armor walk off their pegs, while the wind whistles louder than one of Handel's choruses, and the still air is more melancholy than the dead march in Saul. Such are the dresses and decorations of a modern novel, which, as Bayes says, one's calculated to elevate and surprise, but in doing so, carries the young reader's imagination into such a confusion of terrors, as must be hurtful. It is to great purpose, indeed, that we have forbidden our servants from telling the children stories of ghosts and hobgoblins, if we cannot put a novel into their hands which is not filled with monsters of the imagination, more frightful than are to be found in Glanville, the famous Huggehu of our forefathers. A novel, if at all useful, ought to be a representation of human life and manners, with a view to direct the conduct in the important duties of life, and to correct its follies. But what instruction is to be reaped from the distorted ideas of lunatics, I am at a loss to conceive. Are we come to such a pass, that the only commandment necessary to be repeated is, Thou shalt do no murder? Are the duties of life so changed, that all the instructions necessary for a young person is to learn to walk at night upon the battlements of an old castle, to creep hands and feet along a narrow passage, and meet the devil at the end of it? Is the corporeal frame of the female sex so masculine and hardy, that it must be softened down by the touch of dead bodies, clay-cold hands, and damp sweats? Can a young lady be taught nothing more necessary in life, than to sleep in a dungeon with venomous reptiles, walk through a ward with assassins, and carry bloody daggers in their pockets, instead of pincushions and needle books? Every absurdity has an end, and as I observe that almost all novels are of the terrific cast, I hope the insipid repetition of the same bugbears registered will at length work a cure. In the meantime, should any of your female readers be desirous of catching the season of terrors, she may compose 2 or 3 very pretty volumes from the following recipe. Take an old castle, half of it ruinous. A long gallery, with a great many doors, some secret ones. 3 murdered bodies, quite fresh. As many skeletons, in chests and presses. An old woman hanging by the neck, with her throat cut. Assassins and desperados, quant, stiff. Noises, whispers, and groans, 3 score at least. Mix them together, in the form of 3 volumes, to be taken at any of the watering places, before going to bed. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Many elements in Coleridge's poetry, the account of the skeleton ship in the rhyme of the ancient manor, for instance, or the atmosphere, setting, and fragmentary plot of witchery and seduction in Christable suggest how absorbing he found the novels of the terrorist school. His letters from the 1790s sometimes reveal him sitting up all night, trembling, he says, like an aspen leaf as he turns their pages. But elsewhere Coleridge's writings indicate how complex and ambivalent the Romantic poet's recession to Gothic writing could be. As a first example we provide his scathing review, published in the Critical Review in February 1797, of The Monk. It should be noted that Coleridge's reaction to Matthew Lewis's novel is, for all its alarm, much more measured than those of most of his fellow critics. Front Review of The Monk by Matthew Lewis. The horrible and the preternatural have usually seized on the popular taste, at the rise and decline of literature. Most powerful stimulants, they can never be required except by the torpor of an unawakened, or the languor of an exhausted, appetite. The same phenomenon, therefore, which we hail as a favorable omen in the belles lettres of Germany, impresses a degree of gloom in the compositions of our countrymen. We trust, however, that satiety will banish what good sense should have prevented, and that, wearied with fiends, incomprehensible characters, with shrieks, murders, and subterraneous dungeons, the public will learn, by the multitude of the manufacturers, with how little expense of thought or imagination this species of composition is manufactured. But, cheaply as we estimate romances in general, we acknowledge, in the work before us, the offspring of no common genius. The tale is similar to that of Santon Barzista in The Guardian. Ambrosio, a monk, surnamed the Man of Holiness, proud of his own undeviating rectitude, and severe to the faults of others, is successfully assailed by the tempter of mankind, and seduced to the perpetration of rape and murder, and finally precipitated into a contract in which he consigns his soul to everlasting perdition. The larger part of the 3 volumes is occupied by the underplot, which, however, is skillfully and closely connected with the main story, and is subservient to its development. The tale of the bleeding nun is truly terrific, and we could not easily recollect a bolder or more happy conception than that of the burning cross on the forehead of the wandering Jew, a mysterious character, which, though copied as to its more prominent features from Schiller's incomprehensible Armenian register does, nevertheless, display great vigor of fancy. But the character of Matilda, the chief agent in the seduction of Antonio, appears to us to be the author's masterpiece. It is, indeed, exquisitely imagined, and as exquisitely supported. The whole work is distinguished by the variety and impressiveness of its incidents, and the author everywhere discovers an imagination rich, powerful, and fervid. Such are the excellencies, the errors and defects are more numerous, and, we are sorry to add, of greater importance. All events are labelled into one common mass, and become almost equally probable, where the order of nature may be changed whenever the author's purposes demand it. No address is requisite to the accomplishment of any design, and no pleasure therefore can be received from the perception of difficulty surmounted. The writer may make us wonder, but he cannot surprise us. For the same reasons a romance is incapable of exemplifying a moral truth. No proud man, for instance, will be made less proud by being told that Lucifer once seduced a presumptuous monk. Into Luzo did, or even if, believing the story, he should deem his virtue less secure, he would yet acquire no lessons of prudence, no feelings of humility. Human prudence can oppose no sufficient shield to the power and cunning of supernatural beings, and the privilege of being proud might be fairly conceded to him who could rise superior to all earthly temptations, and whom the strength of the spiritual world alone would be adequate to overwhelm. So falling, he would fall with glory, and might reasonably welcome his defeat with the haughty emotions of a conqueror. As far, therefore, as the story is concerned, the praise which a romance can claim, is simply that of having given pleasure during its perusal, and so many are the calamities of life, that he who has done this, has not written uselessly. The children of sickness and of solitude shall thank him. To this praise, however, our author has not entitled himself. The sufferings which he describes are so frightful and intolerable, that we break with abruptness from the delusion, and indignantly suspect the man of a species of brutality, who could find a pleasure in wantonly imagining them, and the abominations which he portrays with no hurrying pencil, are such as the observation of character by no means demanded, such as no observation of character can justify, because no good man would willingly suffer them to pass, however transiently, through his own mind. The merit of a novelist is in proportion, not simply to the effect, but, to the pleasurable effect which he produces. Situations of torment, and images of naked horror, are easily conceived, and a writer in whose works they abound, deserves our gratitude almost equally with him who should drag us by way of sport through a military hospital, or force us to sit at the dissecting table of a natural philosopher. To trace the nice registered boundaries, beyond which terror and sympathy are deserted by the pleasurable emotions. To reach those limits, yet never to pass them, high abhor. High opus est figures that shock the imagination, and narratives that mangle the feelings, rarely discover to muse, and always betray a low and vulgar taste. Nor has our author indicated less ignorance of the human heart in the management of the principal character. The wisdom and goodness of Providence have ordered that the tendency of vicious actions to deprave the heart of the perpetrator, should diminish in proportion to the greatness of his temptations. Now, in addition to constitutional warmth and irresistible opportunity, the monk is impelled to incontinence by friendship, by compassion, by gratitude, by all that is amiable, and all that is estimable, yet in a few weeks after his first frailty, the man who had been described as possessing much general humanity, a keen and vigorous understanding, with habits of the most exalted piety, degenerates into an uglier fiend than the gloomy imagination of Dante would have ventured to picture. Again, the monk is described as feeling and acting under the influence of an appetite which could not coexist with his other emotions. The romance writer possesses an unlimited power over situations, but he must scrupulously make his characters act in congruity with them. Let him work physical wonders only, and we will be content to dream with him for a while, but the first moral miracle which he attempts, he disgusts, and awakens us. Thus our judgment remains unoffended, when, announced by thunders and earthquakes, the spirit appears to Ambrosio involved in blue fires that increase the cold of the cavern, and we acquiesce in the power of the silver myrtle which made gates and doors fly open at its touch, and charmed every eye into sleep. But when a mortal, fresh from the impression of that terrible appearance, and in the act of evincing for the first time the witching force of this myrtle, is represented as being at the same moment agitated by so fleeting an appetite as that of lust, our own feelings convince us that this is not improbable, but impossible, not preternatural, but contrary to nature. The extent of the powers that may exist, we can never ascertain, and therefore we feel no great difficulty in yielding a temporary belief to any, the strangest, situation of flings. But that situation once conceived, how beings like ourselves would feel and act in it, our own feelings sufficiently instruct us, and we instantly reject the clumsy fiction that does not harmonize with them. These are the two simple mistakes in judgment, which the author has fallen into, but we cannot wholly pass over the frequent incongruity of his style with his subjects. It is gaudy where it should have been severely simple, and too often the mind is offended by phrases the most trite and colloquial, where it demands and had expected a sternness and solemnity of diction. A more grievous fault remains, a fault for which no literary excellence can atone, a fault which all other excellence does but aggravate, as adding subtlety to a poison by the elegance of its preparation. Mildness of censure would here be criminally misplaced, and silence would make us accomplices. Not without reluctance then, but in full conviction that we are performing a duty, we declare it to be our opinion, that the monk is a romance, which if a parent saw in the hands of a son or daughter, he might reasonably turn pale. The temptations of Ambrosio are described with a libidinous minuteness, which, we sincerely hope, will receive its best and only adequate censure from the offended conscience of the author himself. The shameless harlotry of Matilda, and the trembling innocence of Antonia, are seized with equal avidity, as vi. Clees of the most voluptuous images, and though the tale is indeed a tale of horror, yet the most painful impression which the work left on our minds was that of great acquirements and splendid genius employed to furnish a mormo registered for children, a poison for youth, and a provocative for the debauchee. Tales of enchantments and witchcraft can never be useful, our author has contrived to make them permicus, by blending, with an irreverent negligence, all that is most awfully true in religion with all that is most ridiculously absurd in superstition. He takes frequent occasion, indeed, to manifest his sovereign contempt for the latter, both in his own person, and, most incongruously, in that of his principal characters, and that his respect for the former is not excessive, we are forced to conclude from the treatment which its inspired writings receive from him. Ambrosio discovers Antonia reading. He examined the book which she had been reading, and had now placed upon the table. It was the Bible. How, said the friar to himself, Antonia reads the Bible, and is still so ignorant. But, upon a further inspection, he found that Elvira had made exactly the same remark. That prudent mother, while she admired the beauties of the sacred writings, was convinced that, unrestricted, no reading more improper could be permitted a young woman. Many of the narratives can only tend to excite ideas the worst calculated for a female breast, everything is called plainly and roundly by its name, and the annals of a brothel would scarcely furnish a greater choice of indecent expressions. Yet this is the book which young women are recommended to study, which is put into the hands of children, able to comprehend little more than those passages of which they had better remain ignorant, and which but too frequently inculcates the first rudiments of MCE, and gives the first alarm to the still sleeping passions. Of this was Elvira so fully convinced, that she would have preferred putting into her daughter's hands Amadis de Gaul, or the valiant champion, Tyrant the White, and would sooner have authorized her studying the lewd exploits of Don Gallagher, or the lascive one-us jokes of the damsel Plazer de Nuumda. Volume 11, p. 247. The impiety of this falsehood can be equalled only by its impudence. This is indeed as if a Corinthian harlot, clad from head to foot in the transparent thinness of the Cohen vest, should affect to view with prudish horror the naked knee of a Spartan matron. If it be possible that the author of these blasphemies is a Christian, should he not have reflected that the only passage in the Scriptures, which could give a shadow of plausibility to the weakest of these express signs, is represented as being spoken by the Almighty himself? But if he be an infidel, he has acted consistently enough with that character, in his endeavors first to influence the fleshly appetites, and then to pour contempt on the only book which would be adequate to the task of recalming them. We believe it not absolutely impossible that a mind may be so deeply depraved by the habit of reading lewd and voluptuous tales, as to use even the Bible in conjuring up the spirit of uncleanness. The most innocent expressions might become the first link in the chain of association, when a man's soul had been so poisoned, and we believe it not absolutely impossible that he might extract pollution from the word of purity, and, in a literal sense, twr and the grace of God and to wantonness. We have been induced to pay particular attention to this work, from the unusual success which it has experienced. It certainly possesses much real merit, in addition to its meretricious attractions. Nor must it be forgotten that the author is a man of rank and fortune. Yes. The author of the monk signs himself a legislator. We stare and tremble. 1797. From Biographia Literaria. From chapter 31. For as to the devotees of the circulating libraries, I dare not compliment their pastime, or rather kill time, with the name of reading. Call it rather a sort of beggarly daydreaming, during which the mind of the dreamer furnishes for itself nothing but laziness and a little mawkish sensibility, while the whole material and imagery of the doze is supplied extra registered by a sort of mental camera oscura registered manufactured at the printing office, which pro tempore fixes, reflects, and transmits the moving phantasms of one man's delirium, so as to people the barrenness of 100 other brains afflicted with the same trance, or suspension of all common sense and all definite purpose. We should therefore transfer this species of amusement, if indeed those can be said to retire amusees who were never in their company, or relaxation be attributable to those, whose bows are never bent, from the genus, reading, to that comprehensive class characterized by the power of reconciling the two contrary coexisting propensities of human nature, namely indulgence of sloth, and hatred of vacancy. In addition to novels and tales of chivalry in prose or rhyme, by which last I mean neither rhythm nor meter, this genus comprises as its species, gaming, swinging or swaying on a chair or gate, spitting over a bridge, smoking, snuff-taking, tete-a-tete quarrels after dinner between husband and wife, conning word by word all the advertisements of the DMLY advertiser in a public house on a rainy day, etc., etc., etc. 1815 1817.